glad you all joined us. It is here to discuss about authentic assessments. And I just want to, first come out and say that I have no conflicts. Anything that you hear me talk about that has to do with medical stuff, obviously go back and find out what's up with your scope of practice in your state. And from educational content, really looked at everything that is in here. This is based on evidence-based theory and practice. And it's really something that is not meant to supersede anything that your policies may dictate that you would have to do or not do. With that, I also have to make sure that I give this wonderful disclaimer: is that the views that are here are mine, and they do not necessarily represent my employer. So my my name is Tim Reitz. I am a former program director for a paramedic program. I was there for 25 years. I now work for a state agency, and currently doing two roles in that area. One is education, and another is handling part of the regulatory compliance issue. So get to have a little bit of experience on both sides of the house there. I think a lot of times when our students go out to get hired, what are we supposed to take a look at? And I think one of the things that most people say, well, what is it that you did in school? Do you have any real world experience? And I think in a lot of the generation that is existing today is that it's that piece of paper that really makes a difference for them, that they can do everything. But the reality is that we probably just set them up for tests. And that is one of the biggest things that we have to try as educators to try and move away from. Like, the test is important, don't get me wrong, but we have to look at how well we can really prepare our students for the real world. And hopefully by the end of today's session, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to help build up what is going on with the world. So, I've asked this question before to a bunch of folks. How do you evaluate students? And a lot of times the answers you get back are, well, they have to do student minimum competencies from a psychomotor standpoint. From the affective domain, we all know that that's probably one of those weaker areas that, I'm not saying it's bad, I'm just saying it's a weaker area for accreditation, because I think that people are like, well, how do you really evaluate the behavior of those students? And then when you get to the cognitive part, we start taking a look at how in the world do we really evaluate them on a testing performance? And all of those things, people are like, well, what tools do we use? And that's where we really have to start taking a look at things, because it's not always about multiple choice exams. I will tell you that my first theory prior, and this was a lot of times it was prior to COVID, because it was a changeover. That's what BC is now, before COVID, that we had people that were getting evaluations that were multiple choice exams. And I still believe they have to have those. But there's other ways in which we really want to make sure that we can blend things together and evaluate our students in a much better process. This is where that authentic assessment comes in. This is where we want to blend them into the real world. What is it that we can bring in to bring our real world experiences into something that the student is going to be able to apply? And really, it is talking about connecting what students are taught in school to real world issues and how to deal with those problems in application. What is it that they're going to be able to do? I think that, just driving here, right, to where I had to come today, I come across on the opposite lane on a major highway is a crash that just occurred. You can just see that the vehicles people were just starting to get out. But the first one of the vehicles was blocking two lanes on a roadway with a lot of water, a lot of trucks around it. And how is that student going to be able to come out today and be able to identify what scene safety is when we just say PSI scene safe gloves are on, if they're not asking, what is it that you would do? Give us some ideas as to how you would position the ambulance. Those are different concepts that we really have to take a look at and explore just a little bit more. So as we go through this, we're going to find out that there's really 4 different areas that we like to look at for an authentic assessment. By the way, authentic assessment isn't just a buzz term that has been used like recently. It's been in existence for well over 10 years in much of the literature, some going back even longer than that into the 90s. So it has just been being, I think, developed a little bit more. We know a little bit more about it. So it is obviously looking at realism. We want to also look at what is that cognitive challenge that we can give to our students. What about our evaluations and how they can evaluate what they have? What is their judgment going to be? And really, if you take a look at that, we're going to say that those areas are going to be more of the critical thinking. How is it that they're going to evaluate what they should or shouldn't do? And then finally, what is the feedback? And from an educator standpoint, I will tell you that the feedback was probably the worst for me if it was written format. If I had to give written feedback to students on a paper, it was harder because it took more time. That's why we like a lot of times the multiple choice questions. I can address those. But there's other things that we can do to really help and build that feedback to individuals as we're building an authentic assessment. So let's take a look at one way in which we're trying to build that authentic assessment and what hopefully we mean by that. So my analogy has to go to football. It's one of the ones that, for whatever reason, I find that football is just one of those easiest things to take a look at. So right now, if you were a player, we'll just say that you were the quarterback, and that would be you right here, the wonderful little quarterback. And as that quarterback, you are looking at a playbook and you notice that you have like 5 options that exist here to throw the ball to. And one way you're trying to move this ball down the field, and you now know where people are supposed to be. Now, when you take a look at that, this is something that we're going to have to start practicing with, right? So we see the whole part of what the play is, but they're going to have to take this play and are going to have to practice it. So they go over to the one side of the field, and this is where they start practicing this. They're running the routes, they're making sure that everything is working well. And then at some point, if they just went out and they were suddenly into the real game scenario, yeah, I'm a Steeler fan, so got to throw that in there. This is from last year, not this year. But if I have to look at this, a couple of things that are missing is that here's the defense. While they may be lined up at the same area for, uh, um, on the field, and I have somebody that's in the backfield who's now been moved over here. What's going to happen? Is this individual coming back here? Because I have to move this ball. And now this quarterback has a lot more cognitive load and has to try to problem solve. Did we prepare them for it? If they only played this way and they only played against imaginary people, they weren't going to do well when it hit the real world experience. So they did get the whole part, but when it came to the real world, they have to make adaptations. And that's what we're talking about. The other part of this, though, is that we're going back to a general philosophy or teaching aspect of whole part whole, right? Teaching the whole thing, break it down into little parts, and then present them with the whole part again. So let's go to just the basic everyday thing. We got to get physically ready. We're not going to get into all that with a lot of our students, right? We're not going to find out how well they are physically prepared, but I have to question that. It's a subject for another day, but as we know that we have more people, at least in our area, we have more people that are getting a little bit bigger. The maintenance of houses may not be great. And now all of a sudden, yeah, sorry, Bill, I just saw that to relate to basketball. I don't do well with basketball. I mean, I know you guys got a great basketball program there, but so if the houses are not being maintained well, how do we make sure that that student is able to extricate somebody out physically? Are they able to handle that? So they're going to send them in this aspect, just for the football idea here, is that they're going to start doing some motions. They're going to start getting down to the basics of just getting used to doing some physical activity and physical movement. Then they're going to break each part down and are going to practice each individual part of that play. And as they break each part of that play down, now you see that maybe they put how this cornerback may be here, right? So you only have a couple people that are here, but we're still breaking it down into parts so that everybody knows what their true role is. Hence the idea of teamwork. Well, when they have to deal with a lot of this, the most important part of things that we look at, and particularly that really fosters learning, is the feedback. How does the student get their own feedback, and how do we give them feedback? We say, oh, yeah, hey, go over here and do this. And, oh, you finished that? That's fantastic. You come back. We may not know what's going on. So I've said in other presentations, one of the biggest issues, or one of the reasons why I like looking at football, is because it's methodical, right? Their goal is to go and get into the end zone and score 6 points. If they don't, and they go to fail, they fail with flair, and they fail with flair in one of two areas. They punt the ball to get it further down the field so that they give themselves a better chance and that the failure doesn't cost them much, or they can kick a field goal to get 3 points. So their goal, though, is ultimately to get across the end zone to score points. Every single time that they don't do that in a drive is a fail. So they work to improve that over time. And that's where we have to take a look at these things. What is it, the feedback that we're given to the students? So you bring that whole part in, you break it down into its individual segments, and then you start to look at that feedback. Definitely things that in the group that I've seen here, all experienced, you all understand exactly what it is that we're looking at for that whole to break things down. Enter into the things that we have to do now. The things that we have to do include looking at meeting the requirements for our students and what our programs are. So one of the first would be, what about the COA process? What are we doing about the student minimum competency as it relates to paramedic? What are we now going to do with the student minimum competency as it's related to EMT? And we know that there are many states that have already begun to adopt student minimum competencies for EMTs. Well, I think that the way that we've seen things, or the way that things have progressed, we went to a mandatory COA accreditation, or national accreditation, that occurred that everybody had to have this by 2013. And it put all the paramedic programs in an area in which you said, we're going to be doing the same thing. We're measuring the same aspect of things. We're making sure that you've met student minimum competencies. Now, obviously, each program can do something a little bit different, but at the end of the day, we know that we're measuring those things. We had a hurdle to jump. And as a matter of fact, that hurdle, after we got into the requirements in 13, in 16, registry had changed the exam process for the psychomotor to bring it into where there's a portfolio process. So I think we're kind of still stuck on what is that portfolio process, but it still comes down to the end. What is your student minimum competency? How are you tracking that information? That's where we're going to get into here in a minute. Now we have the AEMT. And I think that we're going to see that as this starts to become an optional requirement for accreditation in the future, that many states or our exam agencies, such as National Registry, are going to look to say, you need to have this to be able to sit for an exam. We're moving the system forward. We're making requirements, and that's a good thing. But how do we get our own requirements met? How do our educators and our teachers in the classroom able to achieve these goals? Well, we have to take a look at these things and break them down to help understand where is it that our students need to be familiar with the information. And everything breaks down to essentially Bloom's. And when we talk about Bloom's taxonomy, the problem, one of the issues, I shouldn't say it's a problem, one of the issues and concerns is that we see that there's a lot of test development processes that you may get from a textbook or people that are writing an exam that really is dealing with the recall issues. So we're going to say these are the lower areas of remembering and understanding. But when they go to take a certifying exam, they're actually going to be up here. So we're not preparing them. Oftentimes, people are not preparing them to go into that aspect. And when it comes down to the skill, are we keeping it down here to the lower levels, or are we taking it to the upper levels? And this is where that whole process of looking at whole part whole is. There's nothing wrong with teaching them to do an individual skill. and then they have to build upon it. And we'll give you an example here in a little bit, but you will see that the lower order issues that we have to deal with are all teacher led. So how do we get them all up into the student centered area? Well, one of the first things that is here, and these are, I don't want to say that we're doing it wrong. We're doing it not as great as what we should do when we come to trying to just educate our own folks, right? And I don't have a whole lot of the interactivity that is going to be here. That would be, let's make this more student centered. You're sitting here, you're listening to me. It's depending on where you're at, it's lunchtime, and you may just be listening to this in the background. So, how engaged are you? So, trying to get this to those upper levels can be a little bit more difficult. So, how can we create processes in which not only do we teach it to that aspect, but how are we now going to evaluate? So, it is great. We fall back on to the direct lecture. I'm the sage on the stage saying, here's what I think you should do. And it's a way in which I can get you a lot of information. By the way, I do have resources for you as well. So that's the important part. So let's take it back to a basic skill. And one of the basic skills that I would say is let's look at a hair traction splint. So when I was putting this together, I asked a bunch of folks. I said, so tell me, when you learned about a traction splint, what were you taught? They said, oh, I was taught in 1976 about a hair traction splint. And they talk about it was used for a femur fracture, and you couldn't put it on it if they had a problem with their ankle or their knee or their hip. But yeah, and I'm like, really? So you learned that in the 70s? Like, yeah, okay. So how many times did you use it? A handful of times. But the individual that I asked who said that said they used it a lot in the emergency room, where he ended up working for over 20 years. And he said, yeah, we used it a lot. They relied on me and other EMS providers to know a little bit more about it because we used it more frequently. Well, probably don't use it as much as what we think, but okay. I said, so when you put that on, how did you practice? We just put it on. Okay. So somebody else told me they said the same thing. Somebody else goes, oh, they came out and said, here's what you need to look at. Here's a traction splint. You just pull pressure on their leg and you're done. You don't need to worry too much about it because it's not on a test. Well, the test of life, that's where it's at. So there was a couple different areas of things that we were looking at. And then somebody goes, hey, Tim, you know what? Not only did we learn about a hair traction splint, we also learned about a Sager. And I said, huh. So tell me about a Sager splint. And they brought up the same thing. They said, a Sager splint you can use for femur fracture, and they gave all the different contraindications that we had heard before. But said the really great advantage of this is that you can use it for both femurs. And somebody said, oh, well, I was told in a class that it was used only for both femurs. So bilateral fractures. They're like, yeah, that's the only time you can use it. So now we already have a controversy of what is being taught. How are we going to get that then evaluated? Well, that's just on the skill itself. One of the other things is that which one are they going to use? Because if they're mixed up and they talk to each other, because God knows everybody talks to each other, they're going to have to try to figure out what's going on. I always would like to think that they phone an educator, but the reality is that they'll always phone an educator. They're going to ask their buddy who may or may not look this stuff up. But, real life situation where we'd like to see happen is that FTO be able to sit down and say, hey, let's go over this because this is a training issue. We need to improve on this. Here's our tools. Here's things that we can work with. But we're still only focused on the skill. Question, though, is how do you get that person who has a femur fracture onto the stretcher and into the ambulance? When I asked that question, everybody's like, well, just put them on a backboard. How are you going to put them on a backboard? Somebody goes, well, let's put them on a scoop. Okay. How are you going to put them on the scoop? How are you going to put them into Stokes? Because these were all answers I got. And then finally, somebody said, wait a minute, I want to know, is it only an isolated femur fracture or do they have other issues? I said, well, stop. I didn't ask you the rest of that. Now, the problem here is that these folks that I surveyed initially were telling me that, hey, this is what we know has to happen. They've had real world experience. When I posed it to a student who I know is currently in a class, comment was, we didn't have to learn that. I don't know. I don't know how I would pick them up off the floor and put them onto the stretcher. I have no idea. So what is it that they're being taught? How are they being evaluated? These are learning experiences that we're truly missing out on. And that's where a lot of this comes in. We're coming back to, we looked at the pieces, but did we bring it back to have the whole part actually exist? So where do we start to evaluate these? And I know for time we've had issues with what's formative, what's summative. And again, I came across this evaluation type view, right? Here's what it is. And I heard this before as a recipe, but I really like this. I'm in the back, I'm the chef, I'm preparing a soup, and my formative evaluation is going to occur when I dip my spoon in and I take a little taste and I realize that it needs a little bit more pepper, a little bit more salt, and a little bit more, let's say, oregano, right? So I stir it back up and I add it to it and I take a sip. So it's fantastic. So my formative was checking to see that as I was making it, that everything was working well. That's going back to that hair traction. I'm looking to see that they put it on correctly, that they understood the indications, contraindications, and how they were going to work it. The summative evaluation, though, is now going to be where the guest is going to taste that soup. What is it that they taste? If they say, oh my gosh, this is fantastic, great. Somebody else is going to come in and say, oh my gosh, it's too cold. You know, are we dealing with the Goldilocks and the Three Bears where it's too hot, too cold, or just right? So what is it that we have to look at? How do we then evaluate what is it that you didn't like about them? And the same thing comes in as looking at something like a hair traction splint or a traction splint. And they say that traction splint is coming in place. That's something that you need to be able to evaluate it and be able to see that you give them a scenario, not a rote skill, that actually is something that is going to be useful to them and challenging. It shouldn't just be, okay, go put this on. And I see, absolutely, this is an evaluation that does have to occur during the lab. But remember that this is also one of those things that you can blend in to different parts of a class. So if you have everybody that is in person, if you're not doing hybrid, fantastic. Whatever it may be, I can't tell you how to use it in your program. But what I can tell you is that if they've been prepared for something, maybe we do need to come in there and see how we do it as a formative assessment. Well, I have an example of that a little bit later on to give you that idea that even if they're remote, there is something you can do to really get them to come together at a point in time and get a formative and a summative evaluation in on these things. So to move into where we were looking at AEMT. So one of the AEMT student minimum competencies that comes in out of the NCEE document is talking about an uncomplicated and a complicated obstetric delivery. Now, it does indicate that it can be simulation, and there should be at least 3 exposures. So 3 times they are to have something that is either complicated and uncomplicated. Now, that's open for your interpretation. Does that mean that I give them 1 uncomplicated and 2 complicated? And what other ways can I do that? But it tells you that in this category, it's uncomplicated and complicated. Can you put a check mark in there that says, yes, my students did this? What's the scenario? What is it that you're going to give them? How can I put that into that simulation? And that's where we're going to start focusing in as we start bringing these things together. What is it that I can do? And to set this up, we want to break this down into building that authentic assessment. We have 4 steps. You already saw what those 4 are, but we're going to break it down and say, you know what, in step 1, I need to look at a real world wicked type problem. What is it that would occur in the workplace, right? What are those things that might have to occur? So as I start thinking of this, I have to also add in the what, the why, and the how. And the what is, what am I going to test? Or what am I going to evaluate? Well, we're going to evaluate that uncomplicated childbirth. Okay. Why am I going to evaluate? And I don't want the wonderful thing of it's standard. I get that. Why are we really doing it? We're doing it to help prepare the student to know what to do if they come up with a similar situation. That's learning. Now the question is, how am I going to do that? Because there's multiple ways in which I can accomplish that. Is that something I'm going to do straight up as a simulation? And if you look at the definition of that simulation, it does say about the experience as a representation of a real event. I've aided in the delivery of kiddos, and I've had both complicated and uncomplicated deliveries. So have they been a lot in our area? Absolutely not. But it is something that we have to make sure that the student has some type of basis for, so that when they go out into the real world and they're out in the ambulance, if they have this issue, that they can reflect back on it. And it is something that they can pull from that long-term memory and able to apply it. And again, that's preparing them for success. What about using things such as a mind map? And when I was putting this together, I'll give you two things with this. This is just an example of something I used in a class. Okay. And what I would do would be to put a complaint up. So in this case, the one that's up on the screen is saying chest pain. They have all these different issues that they believe may go on. But the more that I read into it, they were having trouble, and this was in an EMT class, they were having trouble differentiating what the cause is versus what the signs and symptoms are. That was an immediate feedback. They now know that from that formative assessment of the mind map, that is actually helping me go back to tell them this is the difference between a sign and a symptom and what the actual cause is going to be. Right. So if I wanted to say, tell me the signs and symptoms that could be affiliated with a particular condition, now that's totally different. Right. But they kept on putting them all over the place, but it allowed us to have a reorganization. They were able to understand different things. Could they tell me the difference between an MI, if you can see that, an MI versus an acute coronary syndrome? Same type of deal here, though, with somebody who has an uncomplicated childbirth. Tell me about the complicated one. What type of complicated childbirths might you expect? Or what problems would you have? You can have everybody come in, and again, this could be a formative, low stakes type deal. Give them a post-it note and have to put one down. They go up and they throw it up there, and you start a conversation. And by the way, it's no longer the death by PowerPoint, because you have the material. If you want to, you can use your computer to put the presentation on that you want to talk about, and you just have a discussion. It leads you, not them. Right? So you end up leading them, but the presentation that you already prepared is going to help go down the road, and you're doing a real-time evaluation, and you're also able to give them feedback. So maybe you have to put that into a verbal scenario. Another option you can take a look at. The portfolio, I had to come back and definitely look at this one, because I think we had some wonderful opportunities with learning about portfolios. But the thing here is that it helps them reflect. And they need to reflect on what is going on as a learner, and then they apply that information to a complex problem. Again, things that we're looking for. So with a portfolio, I think a lot of times we focus so much on the number of times somebody had to do something and build their portfolio. That's what we all learned, at least as I took away from it. We were so focused on that. Show me the form. You didn't do it if it wasn't there. What kind of students were we putting out there, or graduates were we putting out? So in this case, I think when we look at a portfolio, we want to be able to ask the student that if they went to, we'll give you a real world thing, right? So the student that I told you about, who I know is currently going through a program, they are an EMT student, and they were going to do their time in the emergency room. They were going to then go do their rotation in the respiratory. And I said, so what is it you're going to do in respiratory? Oh, I just follow the respiratory therapist. Okay. Well, what are you going to learn? Well, hopefully listen to lung sounds. Okay. Is that important? And, we went down that whole process. We're like, yeah, but they really didn't tell us a whole lot. but we had to see so many patients. Okay, so you had to see 5 patients, but did you have to do anything with it? No, we just had to see them. What is it that you were doing there? Like, what did you learn? What did you take away from that? Building that portfolio of they had those 5 students, having them reflect on what they learned that day. Do they have their goals? If they're not getting anything out of that rotation, you got to go to the root cause analysis and 5 whys, asking at least 5 whys to figure out what the problem may be as to why they may not be learning anything out of here. Turns out that there was a lack of communication between the instructor and the students, lack of communication between the instructor and the facility, and a lack of communication from the manager of that department to the therapist who were actually with the student, and the student to the therapist, because they didn't actually know what they were going to do. So we are not going to be able to help identify a lot of that stuff. We just get checklists of, oh, they did great. They were awesome. They didn't get in the way. But what did you learn? That's the idea. So I think that's one thing that we probably need to take away from the portfolio process is that when we put all their skills together from the paramedic level, we may have been lacking that narrative. What is it that you learned? So focused on getting the numbers. What is it that you learned from there? It gives us an immediate feedback, that evaluation, and we get to look at and provide feedback to it. Podcasts. So since I see Bill Young is on there, take a look at his 10-minute podcast that he has up. Gives you 10 minutes of information. And those are wonderful things you can do one of 2 things with. So one of those things that you can do with it, actually, you can create or you can listen. So we'll keep it like that. Creating means that you can create it yourself and post it on a podcast post. And they do have ones that are free. Or you can have the students create a podcast where they may be talking with a roundtable discussion or interviewing one of their other students about a condition. Talk to me about emergency childbirth. Tell me what complicated deliveries are. Tell me about uncomplicated deliveries. Why is one worse than the other? Or which one's more difficult? They're now teaching it, which means they're going to retain it a little bit more, but now other students may have the ability to gather information from it. And when you evaluate it, you're getting to hear what their process is. Again, you evaluate, get to provide that feedback to them. That's creating. In actually listening to one, I'll just pull this one up. These guys are out of the UK, and this is called the Recess Room. And they have a section in here on bradycardia, in which they really get into depth. And ironically, and I forget which one it is, but one of them is a paramedic, and his primary area for this is that he loves pathophysiology. That's what his degree was in, is all pathophysiology. So he gets to do all and talk about all the different parts of the heart. And he gets to talk about all the pathophysiology that goes along with the bradycardia. And this one is just in 50 minutes. It is a phenomenal topic to discuss electrical physiology pathways and how to assess folks, and why do we have controversy between a heart rate of 60 that we're teaching in EMT class and beyond that is bradycardia, but yet when we look at why is 50 the number that we're talking about for treatment as it relates to AHA, right? So they discuss how those things come about. They also then talk about action potential, and they talk about how there's 4 different chambers in the heart, and they talk about the electrical pathways. And this is a phenomenal time to bring a podcast like this into your class, play it, stop it, and start having a discussion. Find out what's going on. Now you're making the students come back, you're evaluating where they are, and you're able to identify whether or not they're actually grasping some concepts. You may find that maybe it's too far advanced just yet, and now you help build off that teaching process for it. So you're making that evaluation and you're giving them feedback immediately. And, people will say, well, is this something that I'm going to report, as in, their grade. It may be. That's entirely up to you how you're going to do that. The idea here, though, is that we got to bring them into more authentic assessments that may not necessarily always be 100% summative. How are we going to build this process up? And by the way, I didn't put this in here, but I will tell you that, remember, it's not just one time that they get these things, because you just don't give them, and you saw that just for that childbirth, for that uncomplicated childbirth, recommending 3 times. And the reason is because you got to be able to do it more than just once. What did you learn from the first one, and how are you building that onto the second one? And again, the same type of deal here. Don't just evaluate their ability to look at handling a cardiac emergency, or how are they going to, deal with bradycardia versus tachycardia. Let's bring it all together, make them distinguish those things. This may be one part of the formative, that whole part whole, as to where you're putting that in. You're doing real-time evaluation for yourself. Case study, looking at a complex issue and how it's going to be issued in its real life context. So in this aspect, I had given students this process when we were doing, we did remote, back up. We did remote a lot. And it was more of a hybrid type program. It was live synchronous, where we would have interactivity. We would use different apps to help them answer questions. We would do, just like here with Zoom, if I were to say, hey, throw something in here to the chat, a couple folks may have put something in here, as I have the webinar chat open. I can monitor that off of another screen to see what's going on. So I start to get some of that interactivity. And when you have your class, you've already started to build a relationship with them. So it makes it a lot easier. And it is sometimes very difficult here when you don't know who's all there and where they're all at. But we gave them a case study, and we said, hey, in your case study, you have a week to finish this. Here's what it is. And these are the questions that at the end they had to provide in a written format. It is what's included in your differential, what's your clinical impression, and I believe in your differential, we had to adjust that later on. We had to have them come up with at least 3. What is your clinical impression? Provide some clinical impression and detailed clinical data that they pulled from medical information. It wasn't to be a guesswork. It was they had to go look at some research. And then they had to describe what the pathophysiology was of the condition that they believed it was. And they were to include the organ systems that were involved. Well, when they would do this, so if they had it on a Monday, they had to have it turned in by the following Monday. So there's definitely some planning going on. And there would be something that looked like this. This was a scenario. In this case, this was a 34-year-old male complaining of chest pain. They're 25 minutes from the PCI center. Here's his history. Let's talk about their initial clinical findings, observations. And this was one of their first ones that they had. I didn't like to think that it was very complicated, but again, we created it. So we're like, okay, but it was a cocaine-induced myocardial infarction. And how could they evaluate that? And somebody said, well, this is far-fetched. This was absolutely not far-fetched. This was based off of a real case that happened with one of our students. This wasn't them, but they had this, where they went to Rush Week for one of the universities that was in the area. And this guy was an alum, and he decided to try some cocaine and alcohol for the first time. And he made a big mistake, ended up with some issues with that. Well, what we did, though, is that this is in a couple parts. The first part, again, was giving them the case study. And it was real world. Second part was you have to complete it and you turn it in. When you turned it in, we would review it, but they had to turn it in the day that they came in. They were coming in for a class. They got this as a scenario. This was in a simulation in which they would have a lab, and at one point, this was their simulation. And what it did is it really helped identify those that were doing the work, those that were not doing the work. And we could, I don't want to say guess, but you could see exactly what was going on with those individuals as they process through that whole scenario. What we then did is that there was a summarization of this whole thing because, again, I get it. You don't want people to just like, oh, go away. But remember, the goal is to make them better than they are when they came in. So this video would be made. This is about 30 minutes to go through the whole case in which it would identify how what was found in the EKG, how to break things down, what some of the statistics were. Basically, we did the case study as well. So we did our homework to help build this up and help identify those areas that were covered. And what it did is when we did the evaluation and we did the feedback, particularly in that simulation, it was phenomenal because you were able to see the things that they may have missed, and the review of any time the video was great. They were able to see that, and all of this went into points. When they completed it based off of how detailed things were, was given a rubric to identify. I believe it was up to 100 points because it did take time. It did take a lot of their work to do so, but the feedback from the students was phenomenal. That they loved the approach. It wasn't everything that was mundane, and they knew that this was going to be a simulation at some point. Multiple choice tests or multiple choice questions. The biggest issue that has been out there, and I see mixed literature with multiple choice questions, is that should we really be using them? And the answer, in my opinion, is absolutely. We can build them to higher level thinking, but they have to be complex and it should be real life type context. So just to give you a couple different issues here, right? So how can I take the first one here where you have, again, these are EMT levels that I pulled up. So 34-year-old is experiencing chest pain. They administer aspirin and apply oxygen. And what's this an example of? Well, the answer here is that this is offline medical control. But if you end up talking about this later on after a test and people were saying, well, no, this is a compliance to the standards. Okay, now we have a discussion that we can have in class to find out about what it is that they know. It's not just about what the answer is. It's about the knowledge and the information that's behind what they chose. What blood component is responsible for fighting off infection? Relatively low level. However, when you do the review, and again, I would not put this as a summative exam. That's just this question is very low level for that. But the blood component, tell me about platelets, tell me about the red blood cells, and tell me about the plasma. Yeah, it was the white blood cell, but tell me about these other ones. Let's discuss what each role is, because we need to, again, evaluate and check for that knowledge and provide the feedback as to why these things are important. And particularly looking at how the platelets come into play, because we teach them about shock, particularly with trauma, and we talk about how the capillary sphincters can open and close during shock and cause little microemboli and how they cause problems in the organs. Now that EMT may not know everything that's ongoing with that, but they know that the platelets stick together, which can cause a clot. And when they start to cause a clot, this means that it could go into an organ and block something up. But if I am actually able to ventilate and help control those things, now they can link those things. And now when they sit into the real world, they're sitting there saying, I have to focus on my ventilation because this is what could possibly happen. A couple articles that are here, how to do with some do's and don'ts, and then constructive look at measuring some higher order thinking. Again, just some things in here as we go forward that, I brought them up saying, hey, here's some ideas of things that you can do. So, all right, just for time, we're going to move quickly, I see here. So we create that authentic assessment for an uncomplicated delivery. We want to find out now about the assessment. Again, the what, the why, and the how. So in this case, let's look at two things. We're going to create what I'm going to call an active scenario, more of a simulation type deal, right? We're going to bring somebody in. We're going to have them do an imminent delivery, and they have an anxious and quote pushy type spouse. that says, hey, hurry up, tell me what's going on. They're going to get that. That's real world. They're going to have somebody as the bystander. Well, maybe let's move the next one starting into a case scenario in which there is an imminent delivery, but this is with a group of folks, ethnically could be, that is not allowing men to deliver babies. And how are they going to overcome that? So this is a critical thinking question, because if this is actually something that is happening, now I have to be able to address that. In Pennsylvania, we have to deal with this with the Amish folks. And there's a lot of times that they have the midwives that are actually delivering. When things go wrong, that's when EMS gets called. So they have to address the different issues and be aware of what are the ethics, what are the morals, what are the legal issues that are here. This is something they're going to have to deal with in their own area. So you can bring that flavor in to help them prepare for what's going to come on next. Again, the what, the why, and the how for everything that we take a look at. How are we going to evaluate them? You can use that formal rubric. You can use discussions that are led through the lessons that you've learned. We kind of talked a lot about that, so I didn't put a whole lot more in there. But that rubric, I didn't spend. Actually, I didn't even put one in. But just keep in mind that rubrics, if you're getting so lost in the weeds of evaluating things, whoever is evaluating them, including yourself, it's going to be so focused on the form you totally missed what the student was actually doing. So, keep it simple, and that is always going to be the best policy for that. But what is it that they're talking about? We all know those students that when we're evaluating them, that their class participation. Is it like whose line is it anyway, where they get 1,000 points and the points don't matter? What is it that you're doing in class? How can you pull them up? It is active teaching, it is active learning, and it is truly an authentic assessment that you're doing all the time. And they will never know when they're under evaluation. So the last part in here would be that advantage to taking a look at what's called plus delta. Sorry, I forgot where I was at. So if I want to discuss or have a rubric, I can give feedback. Again, my problem with feedback in that is that when a lot of times when it's written, I'm moving so quickly I forget to write everything down. What about students self-evaluate? What is it that they learn? What are things that they were able to do? I could give my students the videos, and I have given them the videos and say, tell me what you learned out of this. And, I just sometimes didn't find that it was always successful for me. Could be successful for you, but they didn't have that possibility of seeing the same things I was. And they didn't want to put it up in front of the classroom and show different things and call somebody out on that. If it was one-on-one, it was a little bit more time consuming and very difficult to do. And we just didn't have the time to be able to do so. So doing that debriefing, that is especially important in any form of simulation. And one of the ones that is very simple, very quick, is looking at something called plus delta. And when you get to plus delta, again, it's asking the three what, why, and how. What went well, what did not go so well, and then ask them that why. Why did it not go so well? And then how will we improve for the next time? So when you're bringing them in, this is a team issue, right? This is you and the team. They are part of that simulation. What went well for the team? What did not go so well for the team, and why? Maybe you'll find out as they go through the 5 whys for the root cause analysis that it was one individual, but they also get to have that part. Now, this you can do in multiple ways. You can have them, what did you do well as an individual? What did not go well for you as that individual, and why? And how are you going to improve for the next time? You can have them tell you this. You can have them discuss it. Or one of the things that I like with this is have them write it down. Because then if they write it down and they keep it into their portfolio as to what they did, and you could call it that at any time and say, tell me what you did. Let me see, what was your area for improvement for next time? So the next time that they get a scenario that is involving a childbirth that is normal, and they did the same thing again, you look at what their journal is and say, what happened here? How can we fix this? You evaluated the first time, they found a problem. You evaluated the second time, there was still a problem. Now we need to see exactly what it is that they did. So you're using that plus delta in the aspect of here's your simulation. We get that immediate feedback, and here's what I believe you can do for the next time. And if they write it down, how well do they work off of that? I think they get I'm blanking on the term, but they get a lot of fake confidence in what they believe that they know. So they don't know as much as what they should. There are questions that do come up. Whether or not you should single barrel or double barrel the questions, and let me explain that. So from your point of view, as you can see here, what was done well, and you get answers. What is it from your point of view that you would like to change, and you get answers? That's just asking them one after another. However, when you double barrel it, you kind of come in and you say, okay, from your point of view, what went well, and tell me what else you would do differently. Now you're going to get folks that are going to have a mixed bag of things. There are advantages and disadvantages to each one. Either one is entirely up to you. It becomes your preference. And it just depends on your group. You may find out that you really want to talk to them about the concerns of what went well, or I shouldn't say the concerns, the good things that went well. But, if you really want to focus in on things that they can improve on, let's find out exactly what it is they think it is. And I've used the double barrel questions in that aspect as well. So I know there was a lot of stuff in there, but in that, hopefully, in all of that summary, with authentic assessments, we wanted to come back and break it down to the what, the why, and the how. And if you can get to the why on a lot of the root cause analysis for the student aspect of asking them, give me the 5 whys. Why did you get down to this area to help find that improvement? That's part of that feedback. The how is definitely what type of system are you going to use? And up to this point, and I know that somebody had mentioned about doing this stuff in the lab. Phenomenal. But what are we doing? We don't always have to do things just in the lab. We don't always have to use multiple choice questions. We can use papers, we can use essays, but make them challenging, make them in high order thinking, because this is going to allow them to apply that information. And when they apply that information, when they come across a question on a certification exam, they feel much more confident about it because it is going to have gone through the process. We recognize that we're not just keeping them beat down to these lower level questions. We're actually making them create, analyze, and evaluate things in a whole different area. And it's going to be richer for them. And it's going to hopefully, when we have the buy-in from the faculty, buy-in from the students, and the environment is set up for this, that it's okay to fail and to learn from it, then we're going to find that our students are going to be happier and their pass rates are going to go up, retention rates stay, and things start to move on. So that's pretty much where I'm at with that process, and it's about 5 till. So my best thing I can tell you here is that if you scan that QR code, it's going to take you to what's called a Wakelet. I use Wakelet where I put this presentation, so it has all the links that are in there, and it actually has the resources going directly to most of them. But it is challenging the status quo. It is tough to just sit in the classroom some days and, we want to go back to lecture because it's the way that we're going to make life a little bit better, at least for us. So get them up, moving, and evaluate constantly. I think makes for that wonderful, that better assessment. So there's that. And I will also there's my contact information. If you need to reach out, I'll be more than happy to share any of this information with you. And if there's any questions, I'll answer them the best I can. And Rio just posted in there, so I'll let her finish up her stuff with that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tim, for such a fantastic presentation. I'm sure everybody took a lot away from this today that they can use in their classrooms. I just posted the link for the CE in the chat. If you missed that, there's not a problem. All of the information will be provided in tomorrow's follow-up email, including Tim's contact information, and the recording to this webinar. So with that, I hope everybody has a wonderful afternoon, and we will talk to you next time. Thank you.